This podcast ponders how we will live in this COVID era.
What's on the horizon?
What should we expect?
Where are the opportunities? We explore the what's next in the next normal.
Taylor, president of Challenge Factory.
The reason every decision we go to make is so difficult is because it's laden with moral hazard. We can't actually judge what's good and bad.
Dave Hardy, president of Hardy Stevenson and Associates.
COVID has really pushed us to think about what healthy cities mean.
Sarah Thorne, president and CEO at Decision Partners.
We've really acknowledged the recognition and the safety and the caring for each other because we've adopted these new behaviors.
Ujwal Kulgud, chief anthropologist and CEO at Motive Base.
And this is not just because of the pandemic, this is because a lot of us have gained new knowledge.
Hello, welcome back to The Next Normal. I'm Erin Trafford.
I'm Dave Trafford.
And there's one big thing that we have not really touched on so far over the course of this season of the show. And we're nearing the end of the season, so I think it's important to talk about it. The concept of technology and energy and sort of the good versus boogeyman conversation that's been happening, especially in the last 18 months or so.
Well, yeah, the things that have bubbled to the surface, of course, climate change, and that has become the extreme weather. We've seen this whole series of hurricanes that have been devastating during this hurricane season, certainly in southern United States, et cetera. But what's curious here for me is that we get into this discussion around energy and we see how we as individuals have affected consumption and had some effect on the climate because we've all been locked down for various periods of time. So we haven't been taking the bus, we haven't been driving our cars, but we have been using energy differently in our homes. So there has been a real sort of in-person experiment and lesson that's gone on here. And that affects everything from, I think, our own sense of planning communities to how is it that we are going to manufacture new vehicles, for example.
I do think it really highlighted the whole vehicle thing because within about a week of those global lockdowns, like you were seeing wildlife traipsing through the streets in major metropolitan areas that you would never have normally seen. And I think what that really brought to the forefront for a lot of people is, okay, is this going to be what we want in the future? How can we actually take more cars off the street? And if that's the question we're asking, is that the right question to be asking right now?
Right. But the beauty of it is it's kind of broadened our peripheral vision on all of this. We aren't as siloed as we might have otherwise been. Now, having said all of that, I think this episode is going to prove that there isn't a simple answer. And any answers that we do come up with is going to be hard work for all of us to embrace what is the next normal. The climate change conversation will focus on a number of things, our own personal habits, what it is, how we waste food, how we drive our cars. But ultimately, this is going to come down to a conversation about how we produce and consume energy. And that in and of itself, you talk about we've always done it this way, institutionally ingrained. Dave Hardy, this might be the biggest nut to crack as far as we're concerned moving forward in this broader conversation about the environment and climate change.
Yes, and I'm going to come at this through two perspectives. One as a planner, but also I was once the president of the largest environmental organization in Ontario. So hear it through that sort of lens. Let me begin with a big observation. COVID has created a global climate science experiment. Who would have thought 18 months ago that we could say, well, what would happen to climate if we took all the cars off the road, if we removed the airplanes from the air, if half the Western workforce worked from home for 18 months? And the results that I can see from the climate scientists I follow is that there's been a global fall in carbon emissions of 21% below 2005 levels, and the ozone layer is starting to repair. I'm quoting here Steve Kuhn, Obama's top scientist. In terms of the next normal, we're seeing significant shifts in how we secure and use energy. And I actually have a positive view of energy and climate change. What I'm seeing is that many of the world's utilities right now are working to get to net zero, and some I'm working with are working to get to zero emissions, which is very positive. But there are two really important issues. First, we have entrenched ideas about what sustainable energy is, and that's getting in the way of delivering new ways of achieving sustainable energy. For example, small nuclear reactors have been with us for 70 years, and they're now rolling out into national grids as a very effective way to reduce climate change or climate emissions. Natural gas is also reliable and has minimal emissions. It's a sustainable energy source, but both are being opposed, in my view, because of ideology. The second thing is that we need to focus or refocus our discussion on China, India, and South Asia. And to me, that's where the conversation needs to strengthen. The changes in energy use are also going to change how we plan our cities. Electric and hydrogen vehicles are going to be ubiquitous in 10 to 15 years. And you just have to see all of the car companies are retooling right now to get electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles. The energy equation is going to change such that we're going to see shopping malls that when the cars are parked there, you have battery storage surrounding the shopping mall. That battery storage, who dare say, could power the shopping mall if it was used. So energy is going to be stored also in our driveways. So it means the local communities, all the communities are going to need much more electricity, but they're going to have electricity sitting there besides each home. Yeah. And so we have to figure out, what is this change in energy use? What is the need for the good climate policy? What does it mean for our communities? And I'm very excited as to how that's going to change the way we live our lives in the next normal.
So Ujwal, let me go to you because I'm sitting here on my desk. It just so happens that, and Dave didn't know this, but I have this flyer that showed up in my mailbox, and it says, "Say no to the nuclear reactor that is being planned, a new one being planned in Oshawa, Ontario, by the Ontario government." And it really does go back to old language around, the boogeyman around nuclear power generation. I mean, to Dave's point, we're going to have to break that. But boy, this is a very powerful message in a very short period of time, and it raises all kinds of fear. And I can imagine that fear is no better motivator than some of the nuanced conversation that our friend Dave Hardy wants to have.
Yeah, it's a good point. The only positive thing, especially that the pandemic has brought, in addition to what Dave was talking about in terms of reducing emissions and the repair and the ozone, is the fact that people are seeing technology differently. And I'll give you one example. The realization that we can now use technology to effectively reduce our reliance on certain types of fossil fuels, especially nuclear technology as an example, is seen in a slightly different light now, because the meanings around it, as long as we talk about technological innovation, the meanings around it are very positive. And one of the reasons for that is that the pandemic has opened our eyes. And when I say our eyes, I mean a general citizen who may not be deeply entrenched in this world of climate change. It has certainly opened our eyes in terms of recognizing the role that good technology can play in helping us move the needle forward, and the role that bad technology has played in the past. So what I'm trying to get at is there's now a distinction between good technology and bad technology, and that distinction is slowly becoming clearer in the mind of the consumer. My own judgment, based on a lot of the research that we're seeing, is that boogeyman narrative that goes around nuclear energy, that's an old narrative. It is dying out, especially among educated young consumers. That narrative no longer has relevancy. So now the question is, what does the demographic look like in Oshawa, for example, and who's going to succumb to that narrative? But in terms of what the future is looking like, we're moving away from that sort of Chernobyl, boogeyman, scary idea.
Yeah, well, I guess, Sarah, the challenge here, though, is it's easy to say, that we can get away from this narrative, but the populist politics that plays into this all of a sudden is another worm in this can that interrupts the conversation and gets at, Dave Hardy's matter-of-fact approach to this that says we need to see the outcomes, not the fear around the possibility of what might happen.
Well, I think that's a good point, and I think that we've done work for the Canadian nuclear industry for years and years and years. I've got some recent research. We were just in the field in May and June, and working on an energy project, not nuclear, but it's very interesting to me to see just since the pandemic how much people's thinking has changed and evolved, to Ujwal's point. People are a lot more thoughtful. People are a lot more considerate of where we're going in the future. And one of the things that was really interesting to me is the degree of interest in having the company really step up and prepare for an electric future. And when we ask people about their changes in their lifestyle, behavioral changes that they would make, most people think that they're going to have an electric vehicle in the next 10 years. We don't go further out than that because I don't think a lot of people have thought about the fact that in 20 years, the electric vehicles will be, living in parking lots with themselves, and we won't have them in our driveways. We won't need to. We'll just summon them up and they'll come and take us wherever we need to go. But I think that the idea of governance is a really important thing to think about here. We need to put pressure on the industry folks are really taking the lead here on making these transformative changes. We need to make sure that our politicians are listening and understanding the nuances and understanding that there are different ways of doing things, that we have outgrown, the 1970s anti-nuke sentiments, and that we're looking for solutions that are going to help get us to that carbon neutral objective, which is critical to us. It's critical to all of us, and from a climate change point of view.
Lisa, let me take you back then to two other episodes, and I think this is relevant to the employee-employer at a very, almost a granular level, because we talked about two things. We talked about skill development in a very broad and kind of, we broke the model and took a three-dimensional look at what our understanding of skills in the next normal as far as the workplace is concerned. That's one thing. And then the second thing, we talked about the social contract and responsibility. And I'm curious to get your read of the pulse of, some of the corporate offices out there that are looking at this and not just saying, well, this is a branding opportunity for us to be seen to be doing the right thing. That they're looking at it as saying, makes for a healthier environment for our employees first. And the second thing is that we have a responsibility and that we are going to take the lead on this and not wait for government to do something about it.
I think there's two dynamics that are pushing us farther and farther into making these kinds of changes. And the first one is the market. If everything's going to start moving where there's more electric vehicles and where innovation and energy is going to transform the way that we do things every day, there's market opportunity to develop new products and services around those technologies and around that energy. And so companies are already looking ahead to say, like, if our consumer base is moving in this direction, this isn't just a corporate social responsibility marketing message anymore. This is a market opportunity for us to think about how does that transform our own products and services, the use of our own supply chains. We see companies that took very early leadership, like Hewlett Packard, on circular economy initiatives to take a look and examine the entire supply chain that they have and how can they make that as sustainable as possible. And we're just going to see companies continue to innovate as they see the market opportunity and where their consumers are. And then the second piece that we're also seeing is a dramatic increase in where companies are wanting to put these things at their core. Challenge Factory is one of those companies. So we are in the final stages of our certification to become a B Corp. And B Corp is a structure out of the US. It's governed around the world. There's a central body. And what they do is they certify and make sure that more than just the marketing message, Dave, that you were talking about, that there is a specific measurable impact that hits certain thresholds on how that company impacts the community that they operate in, the employees that work with them, the environment that they're in, and their overall strategy. It's third-party certified, and it's a stamp that says this company doesn't just do those marketing messages, but core to how they operate, they think about these things, and they demonstrate the impact that they're having. And I think that as we look at the number of companies like ours that are pursuing B Corp certification, or whether it's other levels of certification and qualifications, it's also transforming the work that gets done inside of the companies. Because now, a career development and workforce strategy firm like Challenge Factory needs to be in the sustainability game, because we've said that this is the line in the sand that we're going to draw. That's a very different approach than the way that a typical HR consultancy might have approached their business in the past.
So, Dave Hardy, when we look at that scenario, I mean, we have private sector pushing the ball up the hill. At what point does that affect or inform how you are looking at longer term planning for communities that not only address the need and the ROI that Lisa's talking about, but the health factors that we've talked about in creating a healthy city?
Well, all this progress is very good, and it rolls out into building better communities. Where I see the next normal really needs to focus on is engagement and conversation around these issues. We're too divisive in terms of how we think about energy and other issues as well. And certainly on the whole energy file and the nuclear file, it is among the most complex moral discussions we will have. It deals with risk and anthropology, to Ujwal's point. I for years been trying to figure out, why is it that some groups have deadly risk feelings about this technology and others are, I'll take it away, make it happen. We need to get that conversation going. In many fields, it just doesn't happen. And I talk to my staff, if I had a magic wand, I would try to make sure that we had forums where we can have these discussions where what the private sector is doing is acknowledge that, yeah, they are doing this. It's a reality. What the risks are right, and or at least legitimate for those people who have those risks, and that needs to come out as part of the discussion too. It just doesn't happen, and it needs to happen. And unfortunately, I don't see any level of government right now facilitating, or even private sector facilitating, that really important discussion around energy and how it filters out in all other aspects of how we live.
So before we go any further, I just want to clarify something. Dave Hardy, when we look at what you've just said, are there places that we should be looking at where this is already being addressed vis-a-vis, are there best practices that we are ignoring?
Yes. But unfortunately, I have to go back 20, 25 years. At one point, the churches and universities held like a citizen jury over energy forms, nuclear waste, and so on. It was seen with trepidation by the industry, but the industry eventually came on board. So you had a combined church faith group and synagogues and mosques and so on, universities and utilities all working together. It was called the IPANI process. But you had people respectfully listening to other people's point of view. And the results were incredibly good. Excellent policy that any government could take. But we just, either we don't trust each other to have that conversation, or just don't have time. I don't know.
Sarah, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that, because I've just, at Decision Partners, we've just completed a leading practice review for stakeholder and community engagement. We're writing a community engagement framework for the Army Corps of Engineers. And we wanted to understand kind of what's driving changing thinking and leading organizations really to advance our practice and the work we're doing for the Army Corps. And basically what we've seen is that to Dave's point and also Lisa's point, the language that we use and what we measure is really important. We are what we measure. And what we're seeing is that corporate social responsibility is actually being replaced with more comprehensive environmental, social, and governance, ESG it's called, measures. And these are really, really important because they're elevating the social measures, including stakeholder and community engagement, dialogue, co-creation. They're elevating those to the same levels as financial and climate change reporting. So when we think about that, we have to think about how do we take these leading practices? How do we engage people in a way that's purposeful, they feel is meaningful? And how do we get people to contribute to solutions as we emerge from the pandemic and tackle major changes, as Dave has talked about, to address climate change?
Lisa, one of the things that we look at when Sarah brings the point up, and Dave too, this is great, and we've asked the questions, we've seen that there are best practices, but too often human nature or institutional nature, as the case may be, is to look at the report. That's nice, put it on the shelf, and we let dust collect on it. Yeah, and that really has been the obstacle in many ways. It's not that we don't have the solutions. It's not that we don't have the path to solving some of these or moving forward in a creative way. We have them right in front of us, but for whatever reason, we just let it sit there and fester.
I think that a lot of that has to do with the silos that we think things belong in, and who has the right or who has the obligation to pick up certain conversations, and where should others just follow or have it as a side topic. And one of the windows of innovation that I'm seeing that I think will have a profound impact as we move forward is the number of integrated programs that are now existing within our post-secondary institutions. So it used to be when you went to school, you studied chemistry or you studied economics or, a particular stream. And you spent, if you went to university, 4 years studying that particular topic, maybe a couple of electives in a couple of different areas. More and more of our institutions now are showcasing integrated degrees that are blending, by definition, multiple different dimensions so that students are addressing complex problems from all different angles right from the very beginning of their post-secondary education. That's carrying on with them into the workforce. So they're entering the workforce as integrated thinkers that can see that even if they're not working for a utility, there are things that are happening within the energy sector and energy policy that would be actually quite interesting to bring into their manufacturing plant discussion or into their supply chain discussion. They're being taught how to be better integrated thinkers with a much broader set of base assumptions to be able to be going after. And so as I'm looking at what's happening and what's actually going to help us transform into not just letting things sit on the shelf, that curiosity about things that technically are quote unquote not in your lane or a part of a different silo, the more that we can be educating people in that fashion, the better we'll start to see new decisions being made and new pieces of information being taken off the shelf and used in everyday life.
Ujwal?
There's a concept that's born out of early French anthropologists and semioticians, and it's this concept of how myths develop into facts of nature. And they talk about how narratives develop, constructs start to develop around a particular concept or an idea in culture. And when they're initially developing, they're myths because there's no real so-called hard evidence attached to them. But if we wait long enough, those myths eventually start appearing like facts of nature to the people that absorb this information. I bring this framework up because the same thing happened with GMOs in the food industry. There were myths around GMOs. Companies sat back going, none of this is scientifically valid. We don't need to do anything. They spoke the same so-called scientific language, technical language. It made no difference. Eventually, the myth became a fact of nature, and now it's too late. You can't do anything about it. The same is true of the typical narratives around nuclear energy, and I'm just coming back to that. If we want to change how nuclear energy is seen, we have to change the emerging myths. We can't do anything about the things that are already facts of nature. I mean, I think Netflix still has a show on Chernobyl. That's a fact of nature now. That threat, that fear is a fact of nature. We can't change that now with scientific ideas. That's just not how human beings work. What we have to do is figure out what are the new emerging myths and which of these myths work in our favor if the goal is to reduce some of the fears around this, and how do we co-opt those narratives? How do we change those narratives before, yet again, we lose control over 5 other facts of nature that we can't do anything about.
So we're going to use myths rather than bust myths. So I love that we're going to end on that note, because I love the way these things have kind of come together, right? We started off talking about a very specific subject matter, and we all think that we're in that, idea around energy and the climate. And it takes us out into this much broader conversation. And where we end here is with educating and kind of broadening our minds. So let's pick up that thread in the next episode of The Next Normal. I enjoy these conversations so much, but and every time we look at it, it's almost been like this. We talk about it being a 3-dimensional view of a conversation or a topic, because we started with Dave Hardy talking about, the idea that this is about planning cities and about new vehicles. And I love that he kind of brings it back into the church hall where all of these conversations started, and there might have been even some social activism around how we used energy. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we've got Ujwal, our cultural anthropologist, bringing it right back into culture and talking about how we view that discussion vis-a-vis Chernobyl and nuclear energy because of a Netflix series, which was quite compelling, by the way. But it's an important textured conversation that we're able to have with, these big brains at the table.
I think this was a really great episode to highlight the point that the conversation around the next normal really is about remembering that our society, our government, our workplaces really function as an intersection of all of these things, of economy, of society, of culture, of our household values, and of our national and international values. It's just, this one really put a point on it for me. I mean, just thinking, I was like, my next car is going to be an electric vehicle. And that's how we started this episode. And then through listening to them, have the conversation, I was like, but I'm actually not thinking about what's going to happen when I need to get rid of that electric vehicle and what that's going to mean for our lifestyle. How are we going to retrofit our home? And what is that going to do to my tax rebates, and so on and so forth? Like, there's just so much there.
Well, and what I love, though, is it's not about the scariness of it. Mm-hmm. It quickly became a conversation around opportunities, as both Lisa and Sarah point out, that there are real opportunities here for the market, for, whether it's a new economy standing up, new jobs. There's all that we really need to be open-minded to. So, yeah, we started here, finished there, but boy, we count on these crew to broaden your horizons, and they do it every time we sit down to talk.
Yeah, I think that's what we're going to get into in our last episode of this season coming up next week, where we're going to have that future-looking view to how do we start that education? How do we continue to foster that curiosity and creativity in ourselves and then in the younger generations?
The Next Normal is sponsored by Challenge Factory, shaping the future of work.
By Decision Partners. Our world is a better place when we make better decisions.
By Motive Base, decoding implicit meaning behind what people talk about.
And by Hardy Stevenson and Associates, planning the cities of the future.
Comments, questions, or ideas for our hosts? Feel free to drop us an email at hello@storystudionetwork.com.
This series is produced for the Story Studio Network by Eye Contact Productions.